Greetings, folks, and welcome to our second of three talks on North American English. This time around, we'll be talking about Southern English in the United States and African American Vernacular, of course, with some history thrown in as well to put everything in context. There are, I think, some very valid reasons for discussing these two dialects or dialect groups in the same talk, and I'm hoping I can make that clear by the end of the lecture. We'll start with the South. The Southern American dialect is, as with the Northern Cities shift, primarily a white dialect, though it does influence African American vernacular in some very interesting ways. As mentioned last class as well, the South was settled, or much of the South rather, was settled out of the south and southwest of England. And the settlers, of course, brought with them their speech patterns. They also brought with them many elements of their culture. The time of much of the settlement dates to around the time of the English Civil War, with a split between royalists, those defenders of the monarchy, and parliamentarians. There was a large concentration of royalists or cavaliers, many of them aristocratic by birth, who came to the American South and brought with them a very strict social hierarchy, which in the slave economy that grew up in the South, basically became a social hierarchy on steroids. There was a strict sense of public honor, this also coming out of the aristocratic background of the English settlers, which quite possibly was self-consciously exaggerated for socio-political reasons or performative reasons, as almost maybe even a form of political or social theater. This isn't surprising. When people leave a culture, when they leave a country, they often bring with them an attachment to the ways of the old country that in many ways becomes more devout than in the people who remain. What often occurs is a sort of a sense of cultural nostalgia in which your identity becomes not so much a function of where you are as where you or where your ancestry are from. So it becomes a cultivated affectation in many ways, and sometimes even almost a sort of a fetish. In any case, this is the cultural foundation for the plantation aristocracy, which of course revolved around the institution of slavery. In terms of general patterns shared by, if not all, at least many Southern dialects, we do have a few things we should get out on the table right away before we get down to specifics. One, quite famously, is the tendency to drawl vowels, the famous Southern drawl, taking a long time to say things. This seems to be a self-conscious mark of aristocratic station or affiliation, perhaps associated, again going back to the English Civil War period, with a self-conscious differentiation from the parliamentary forces. That is, it was actually arguably a mark of belonging to a high culture group as opposed to a low culture group often described as being or portrayed as being boorish. Certainly, most of the parliamentarians were not aristocratic. They were associated very often with the dissenting denominations as opposed to with the high church, and accordingly had less patience with such things as ritual, and of course even after the break with Rome, the Church of England remained highly ritualistic, and the Cavaliers were associated, of course, with the Church of England, which became the Episcopal Church in the colonies. That is, the drawl, the aristocratic drawl, may well be simply a cultivated verbal marker of being civilized. Other common patterns include lexical variations such as ax rather than ask, which we also saw with Jamaican Creole, by the way, just to remind you, and which does go back to the Old English verb axion, for to ask. That is, this seems to be a lexical holdover with many centuries of history behind it. Another variation is ain't rather than isn't, which again may well be, although this sounds probably counterintuitive to people who grew up being told that ain't is bad English, this may well be a cultivated aristocratic usage dating back to about the 17th century. Of course, as with much of the English of southern England, the southern dialects of American English tend to be non-rhotic. Not all of them, but many of them. Without a doubt, though, the most distinctive feature of Southern American dialects, in fact, their defining feature, is the Southern shift or Southern vowel shift. Yet another chain shift, and incidentally, a continuation of the great vowel shift. So we should probably talk about that now. It begins with the monophthongization, that is, the reduction to a single pure vowel, a monophthong, of the diphthong I, so the vowel in ride. This effectively completes the transformation of that vowel, which began round about the time of Chaucer. That is, for Chaucer, ride would be pronounced ride, the vowel is pronounced E, and then through processes that we've already discussed, it gradually becomes I, a glide from a low to a high vowel. Well, in the Southern vowel shift, the E element, the second element, which was the original vowel, is dropped. So what once was pronounced ride, and what for Shakespeare would have been pronounced ride, comes in the South to be pronounced rod. This is realized to different degrees in different dialect regions within the South, and is really intense in the inland dialects. So if we take a look at North Texas, for example, the sentence, "I'm flying my kite," would be pronounced something like, "I'm flying my kite." Another feature, and this seems to have followed fairly closely on the monophthongization of I, is vowel breaking, particularly the vowel breaking of a, the vowel in cat. What breaking is the insertion of a consonant, in this case y, into the middle of the vowel. So cat becomes kayet. Additionally, we also see the raising and breaking of the e vowel, as in the word red. This, too, is more common inland than in the southeastern coastal regions. But if you want to push it to its extreme, as it might be pronounced, say, for example, in inland Georgia, the word red would more likely be pronounced rayed. Similarly, the I vowel and the E vowel tend to be slightly diphthongized. This pronunciation is a little harder to detect, but it is present. So rather than hit for the I vowel, it's hit. And rather than me for the E vowel, it's me. So rather than he hit me, it would be he hit me. Now, if we move toward the back of the mouth and take a look at the high back tense vowel oo, as in school, this tends to be slightly fronted, especially in the southeast. So South Carolina, Georgia, Louisiana, where you're more likely to hear, rather than school, school. Also for the back vowels, these tend to be diphthongized upward. So for example, we have the diphthong ow, as in how, being pronounced, depending on where you are, maybe haya and maybe heya. Similarly, the lower back vowels also tend to glide upward. So aw becomes ow. So you don't have a dog as a pet, you have a dog as a pet. And you don't speak with a southern drawl, you speak with a southern drawl. And as long as we're on the topic of the vowel, as in southern, this too tends to go through a bit of a change. It is fronted, sometimes fronted quite considerably. So for example, not southern, but southern. And if you're in Georgia, you ain't gonna give me a hug, y'all gonna give me a hug. Additionally, as I think I mentioned last class, many parts of the South partake of the pin-pen merger, moving the vowel toward I rather than e. So you will stick a pin into something, but you will also write with a pin, not a pen. And as a final couple of bits of Southern vowel-y stuff. We have the relative absence of something called happy tensing. What happy tensing is the tensing up of the vowel in a terminal Y sound, in a terminal E, as in happy or nappy or slappy. That final vowel in Standard English is quite tense. In Southern English, it tends to be more lax. So happy rather than happy. On a related note, we also have the unstressing of the O vowel when it is terminal. That is, fellow, for example, becomes fella. It just moves toward the neutral vowel. It doesn't get a full realization. I think this and the absence of happy tensing both follow a same pattern of just relaxing the mouth a little bit toward the end of a word. And this is, I think, consistent with the overall relaxed tone of the Southern accent, which is also illustrated in its drawl, the relaxed paces and cadences of much of Southern speech. Quite frankly, I do find it quite lovely to listen to. But of course, vowels aren't the only things that distinguish Southern American English from General American English. Most Southern dialects, as I've said before, are Nonrhotic, sometimes very strongly Nonrhotic. So whereas, for example, you don't drive a car, you drive a car, this is something that the South has in common with both New England and New York City dialects. But the non-rhoticity in the South tends to be more emphatic or more pervasive, occurring in medial positions where in other non-rhotic dialects it may not occur. So, for example, while I might move my car forward, if I'm in the Deep South, I might move my car forward. So the medial R also is vowelized. Also, oddly, and this is more common in rural than in urban dialects, the Z sound, the Z, tends to become a D before an N sound. So business becomes bidness. And as in many dialects, the ng sound, which we represent with an NG, tends to be fronted. That is, it moves from a ng with the tongue against the hard palate to an n with the tongue against the alveola. So rather than singing, I might find myself singing. And as a final little detail, and this is not something that occurs in every Southern dialect, but it does occur in many, we find a shifting of accent from the second syllable of some words to the first syllable. So rather than calling the police, you'll call the police. Rather than pouring the cement, you'll pour the cement. And rather than having a friend come and visit you from Detroit, your friend will come and visit you from Detroit. Now, rather than just listen to me, you should probably listen to other people. So I am providing a link here, which you should definitely check out. It'll give you an example of several very interesting and lovely Southern dialects. I'll post this one to the Moodle page as well. That said, I think it might be useful to take a look at a sentence in a couple of different dialects, just to get a sense of what the differences are, not just audibly, but visually. So here's a sentence which I would pronounce, I'm walking my red dog to my kid's school after attending to some business with the police. First, how does that look if we render it in IPA into General American? Well, it would look something like this. And in the transcription, I've tried to take into account rendering unstressed vowels with the appropriate symbol rather than paying attention to spelling. And so we have, I'm walking my red dog to my kid's school after attending to some business with the police. Pretty much the same way as I pronounced it when I read it just above. There are relatively few differences between General American and Canadian English. Now, how might this sentence sound if spoken by someone living in the South? Here I've tried to transcribe it as closely as I can to a Southeast Inland dialect, and it would go something like this. I'm walking my red dog to my kid's school after attending to some business with the police. And you can notice that while many of these differences are actually quite small, they do tend to add up to a very distinct sound, don't they? And what also changes in Southern English, and this seems to go hand in hand with the pronunciation, is the cadences. The cadences are much slower in Southern English than they are in General English or in Northern English. In fact, I find the language quite musical. General American is a very flat dialect, and this also applies to much Canadian English. That is, the voice doesn't rise and fall all that much. And I remember the first time I was teaching this course, I had someone in the class who was from Yorkshire, I believe. And his impression of North American English as he'd experienced it, which of course was Northern English basically, was that it's very monotonous, it's very monotonal. Southern English rises and falls much more musically than does General American or Canadian English. And in this regard, it's actually more similar to British English, which also has a stronger or more distinct rising and falling cadence. Not the exact same cadence as in the South, but there is a rising and falling cadence in much British English that you don't see in North American English. That is, I think there's maybe something that's generally been lost in the prestige dialects of North American English, that perhaps some of the other dialects, for example, many of the Southern dialects, have actually held on to, that is at least aesthetically relevant. That said, Southern dialects, as with any dialect or dialect group, are not merely linguistic phenomena, they're also social phenomena. And as such, they don't exist in a political or social vacuum. Historically, going back at least as far as the Civil War, and I think further back, Southern dialects and Southern accents have been seen as backward or insular or uneducated. This is especially true since the end of the Civil War, and I think became even more current or more pervasively true during the Civil Rights Movement, which was initially a primarily Southern phenomenon, though it did spread to the entire U.S. Also, though, since the 1960s, the Southern accents have often been portrayed as legitimate American or all-American accents. They're among the most recognizable American accents abroad. So that is, they are markers of American identity, of self-conscious American identity, and also tend to embody challenges to what we might call traditional liberal values. Often they will be cultivated as a way of conveying a sense of approachability or down-to-earthness or hominess. Most presidents since 1964 have, if not having been from the South themselves, chosen to live there. And I'm thinking largely right now of George W. Bush's Texas accent, which was very much a cultivated accent. Bush went to Yale. His family's from New England. And yet his persona was very much tied to his Texas-y down-hominess. That is, a Southern accent can also be a social marker of political or social conservatism, and will often be attributed as such, even if that attribution is incorrect. But for the last few decades, there actually has been a gradual decline in many elements of the Southern dialects. The drawl is becoming less pronounced, and is audibly much less pronounced now than it was, say, 50 years ago. The same thing is true with rhoticity and non-rhoticity. Areas where non-rhoticity was the norm are becoming more rhotic, particularly urban areas. There are, of course, reasons for this. One is an increase in education, both primary and post-secondary. More and more speakers are coming into contact with speakers from dialect regions other than their own, who themselves are in positions of linguistic authority. Teachers, for example, educated at universities outside of their particular dialect region. Similarly, of course, as more and more people attend university, they are mixing with a broader range of people and therefore a broader range of accents than had been the case typically even just a couple of generations ago. This influence of non-Southern speakers on Southern students will tend to produce sort of a koine, sort of an accommodation, a drift towards a more neutral accent. Neutral, of course, being relative to the other accents that are in play in a given situation. In many cities as well, there has been a steady influx of white-collar professionals from out of the region. What this results in is people in positions of social or economic prestige speaking with accents other than the distinctive Southern, drawling, non-rhotic accents that are maybe more common locally. And what emerges from this influx of out-of-town white-collar professionals is a relative reduction in the status of the Southern dialects themselves. So increasingly, the Southern dialects, the Deep South accents, are being associated with, even more than before, ruralness, lack of education, cultural backwardness. And I suspect that there is also a political element here too. Among the most conservative places in the United States are rural counties in the American South. So that pattern of speech is associated with, increasingly, political conservatism. And as we've seen in the last election, and in the last few elections, cities on the whole tend to be politically more progressive than rural areas. So this decline of Southern accents in Southern cities, as opposed to Southern rural areas, does seem to at least reflect an increasing political divide between urban and rural areas in American politics. I don't want to say too much more about that there because I don't want to extrapolate too far beyond the data. I'm just positing that as a possibility. In the meantime, I think it's probably time to wrap up with the South and move on to African American vernacular. As for what African American vernacular English is, it is a dialect or sociolect spoken by many African Americans. And this in itself is interesting as the dialect is widely dispersed across the country, while absent in many of the regions connecting those areas in which it is spoken. If you want to get a sense of what it sounds like, then listen to the YouTube clip that I've posted with this slide and pay attention to how the speakers in the clip understand the language, because they're actually describing their relationship with African American vernacular in the clip. And as you listen to them, you will find that there is a relationship here with the language that, of course, goes beyond mere communication. There's a sense of belonging also, and of recognition that accompanies the use of the language or the use of the dialect among native speakers. So give that a listen. Hit pause on this recording if necessary, and then we'll continue in the next slide with a more formal discussion of what the dialect actually is. The origins of African American vernacular lie, of course, in the South. And there is much in common in the phonetics of this vernacular and many Southern dialects, as we'll see in the forthcoming slides. It also has quite a lot in common with various Creoles that we've discussed, Caribbean Creoles, as we saw with Jamaican, and of course the Gullah Creole, which we've also discussed. During and in the years following the Great Migration, so from about 1915 onward, African American vernacular also became an identity marker, particularly as held against the English partaking in the northern cities' vowel shift, where these two dialects seem to have pushed against each other as verbal markers of racial communities or racialized communities whose interests were often at least perceived as being at odds with each other. This dialect or sociolect has had and continues to have a profound influence on the popular culture of the United States, and thus of English-speaking North America as a whole, largely but not exclusively through music. This makes sense, I think, considering that for the first few centuries during which African Americans were in the United States, it was illegal to teach them as slaves how to read. So the only means of cultural continuity available to that community for a long time were oral storytelling and music. So the fact that this culture, broadly speaking, has had such an impact on the mainstream culture of North America is in many ways a testament to its ability to survive for centuries, literally, in the face of profound adversity. As for what it actually is, African American does, as with any other dialect, have its own internally consistent grammar, pronunciation, and stress patterns. It's often depicted by the mainstream, I think in very racist ways, as simply being an inferior form of English, broken English, as is the case, and as we discussed, with a number of the Creoles from also formerly slave areas. That is, very often, the linguistic authority of Standard English is actually used to press down or to undermine the cultural authority of formerly enslaved peoples. This continues down to this day. One of the distinctive patterns of African American vernacular, which we'll discuss below, is their use of the forms of to be, which has a number of very interesting conjugations in African American vernacular, some of which are actually held in common with the Creoles that we've already discussed. In terms of social class and its correlations, the dialect is most common among uneducated people and unskilled laborers. That is, it is a dialect of what we might call an underclass. And as people move up the social ladder, fluency in African American vernacular tends to become less common. So many people in the middle class are bidialectal, which makes sense because these in many cases are people who worked their way up into the middle class from poorer beginnings. But in order to get into the middle class, had to be fully fluent in General American. Among upper middle class Black Americans, African American vernacular is actually not that widely spoken, is not that common. And this also makes sense because among this population, those who have risen to the upper middle class tend, for the most part, not to have come from the lower class, but from the middle class itself. That is, they're further removed from the community for which this dialect is actually the home tongue. In terms of how this dialect works or looks formally, let's just take a look at it the same way we took a look at Southern American English. One of the things that the two dialects or dialect groups have in common is their non-rhoticity. In African American, terminal R's tend to be vowelized in one of two ways. Or R, as in dollar or color, tend to be vowelized as So rather than saying $1, you might say $1. Or our syllables tend to be vowelized as O. So rather than having $4, you might have $4. And just to be clear, if I mispronounce any of these, there's no disrespect intended. It is simply a matter of my not having been raised in this dialect and not having practiced it to the point of mastery. Now, along with non-rhoticity, we also have the vowelizing of L's. Now, you remember that R's and L's are both classified as liquid consonants. They can both function sometimes as consonants and sometimes as vowels, so it's not entirely surprising that what happens with R's might sometimes also happen with L's. So, for example, rather than paying a toll, you would pay a toe. So the ol sound becomes O. Now, when the vowel is an ah rather than an o, that is when it's an open rather than a closed vowel, the vowel itself tends to be maintained, but of course the L is still eliminated or vowelized, so something would be not your fault, but not your fought. Or, as we'll see in a couple of slides, not yo fault. To continue with consonants, generally speaking, a voiced dental fricative, so th, will become a plosive. So them becomes dem, just as we saw with both Jamaican and Gullah. In a medial position, it tends to become a labiodental fricative, so an F sound. So nothing becomes nuffin. It can also sometimes become a stop in a terminal position if it's followed by certain other sounds. So it can become a T sound, or perhaps sometimes a Ch sound. That is a T sound followed by what we would usually spell as an SH. With you, therefore, becomes something like with you, and that sh becomes a glide between the T and the Y. Another feature of African American vernacular, though by no means universal because of course there is variation within the dialect, is the glottalization of terminal stops, particularly unvoiced stops such as T or K, T or K. So rather than saying got, a speaker of this dialect might say got, or rather than saying back, a person might say bat, which means be right back might sound more like be right back. And as long as we're talking about terminal consonants, let's talk about terminal consonant clusters. Unvoiced consonant clusters tend to be reduced, that is simplified. So the SP, ST, SK, FT, and PT clusters tend to be reduced toward the first of the two sounds. So rather than fast, a person might say fas. Rather than soft, a person might say soft. Where voiced clusters are concerned, that is, clusters in which both consonants are voiced, there also tends to be a reduction toward the initial consonant in the cluster. So and becomes an, old becomes ol. Mixed clusters, on the other hand, that is, clusters that contain both one unvoiced and one voiced consonant, tend to be maintained. These are not reduced. So a camp is still a camp, don't is still don't, think is still think, built is still built, etc. In terms of the triple consonant cluster, represented by STR, so stir, as in strength or street, this tends to be reduced by having the T, the middle element, taken out. So rather than street, a person might say sreet. Another feature of African American vernacular with consonants is a tendency to reduce or lose the voicing in a terminal voiced plosive, that is a B, D, or G sound. So a bug, for example, might be a buck, and a club might be a club. And similar to Southern American English, the ng, as in thing or nothing, tends to be fronted as well, so it becomes an n. So nothing becomes nuffin. And that, for the most part, covers the consonants. When we turn to vowels, the first thing we might notice are a number of similarities with Southern American English. One is the monophthongization or reduction of some diphthongs. For example, I is reduced to ah, so my becomes ma, just as in Southern American English. But also in some dialects of African American vernacular, the oi diphthong is reduced to aw. So boil becomes ball. Just as in Southern American English, there is generally a pin-pen merger, and that merger is toward the I sound. So pen becomes pin, get becomes git, or it can also become a diphthong, git, which also has much in common with the diphthongization of I as I in Southern American English. There tends as well to be an upglide on back vowels. You remember that dog becomes dog. This is also the case in African American vernacular, though perhaps not with quite as long a drawl. And a word such as talk, for example, would be pronounced more like talk. There is no caught merger in African American vernacular, and most vowels, aside from the ones I've mentioned, are realized more or less as they are in General American. There is some variation, of course, but the differences are not as extreme as the differences, for example, with the consonants. Another element that African American vernacular has in common with Southern White English is the shifting of stress patterns in some words. So as with, for example, a white speaker from Georgia, a speaker of this dialect would refer to the police, not the police, cement, not cement, and Detroit rather than Detroit. Double negation in this dialect is fine, as it was in Standard English up to about the 18th century. So, ain't nobody gonna find out, or ain't never heard nothing about that, are perfectly fine. These are not bad English, these are simply African American vernacular. Now, I mentioned a few slides ago that there is also in this dialect a distinctive use of forms of to be. So now seems like a good time to me to talk about the African American vernacular verb forms. In the simple present, so we might say he walks in Standard English. In African American vernacular, we have he walk, pronounced he walk. This is used for expressing a general truth. The present progressive, which in Standard English would be pronounced he is walking, could be pronounced he is walkin' or he walkin'. This, of course, as in Standard English, refers to an action that is ongoing at the time of utterance. There's also, and this is where the be verb comes in, a construction, he be walkin'. Be here is used to indicate habitual action. So he be walking by at 5 o'clock means he habitually walks by here at 5 o'clock. If we look at the past progressive, this also is made with a form of be, but not was as in Standard English, in which we might say he was walking. Well, in African American vernacular, this is he been walking. When we come to the present perfect, so he has been walking in Standard English, we find he been walking. That is, the same words are used, but the stress pattern has changed. He been walking is past progressive. He been walking is present perfect. So you've got to have your ear open to the tone as well as the actual words. This implies, of course, protracted action. We might say, in Standard English, he's been walking since 5 o'clock. Well, a speaker of this dialect might say, he been walking since 5 o'clock. There's also a difference in the simple past, and this uses the verb do. So, whereas in Standard English we might say, he walked, in African American vernacular, one would say, he done walked. When we come to the future, there is also a different form, especially where near future intentions are concerned. So we might say, he finna walk. Finna coming from fixin' to. And this means he's intending to walk, or he intends to walk. In Standard English, the closest we can come to this probably is he's going to walk. For the future perfect, which in Standard English would be he will have walked. In African American vernacular, we have he'll be done walked. And this tense, I think, is no more common in AAVE than it is in Standard English. We don't use it all that often. In any case, the uses and tones here are perfectly consistent. They're no less consistent and no less rational than any other verb conjugation system. And with the use of be and finna, and sometimes do, there is a fair bit of overlap, as you may recall, with both Jamaican and Gullah. And this is not surprising, of course, given the common history that these dialects and their speakers share. Of course, any dialect is going to have its own vocabulary, and AAVE is no exception. One thing that is notable, though, is that the vocabulary in this dialect is very flexible. Here I think it might have something in common with Cockney rhyming slang. Not in terms of how the vocabulary is arrived at, but in terms of how it functions as a social marker. As I mentioned above, this is a community that has had a profound effect on the popular culture of North America. What this means is that many words that begin as part of the spoken culture of African American vernacular tend to become part of the general currency of popular culture. Well, when that happens, the words lose some of their initial function of marking the speaker as belonging to that particular community. So as words migrate out from the communities in which they originate to the North American pop culture community, they tend to be dropped by their original speakers and new words to pop up. That is to say, any vocabulary that I can give you is probably going to be outdated by the time I give it to you. I provided here a list of some examples that are pretty well attested, and a number of them are already no longer current. They do, however, at least give you a sense, or a fairly good sense, of the types of word that tend to be in common currency. So, just to take the same approach here we took with Southern American English, let's take a look at a sentence that I came up with all on my very own and transcribe it into the International Phonetic Alphabet so we can get not just an audible but a visual sense of how this dialect works. And again, in my pronunciation, just be clear, it's an approximation at best, and it is certainly going to miss some details of both phonetics and intonation. But the sentence for this example is, I lost my cell phone when I was coming back from my friend's place in Detroit. And here we have it in General American, transcribed into the International Phonetic Alphabet. I lost my cell phone when I was coming back from my friend's place in Detroit. Pretty straightforward. As I said, Canadian English and General American are not that far apart. And there's really nothing in this sentence that would be terribly different between the two of them. Now, if we try that in AAVE, again, using the International Phonetic Alphabet, it goes something like this. I lost my celly when I'd been coming back from my homeboy's crib in Detroit. So details you might notice here include, of course, the vowel change, the for I, the reduction of consonant clusters, so loss for lost, a few changes in vocabulary, of course, the pin-pen merger, the use of been as a copular verb in the past progressive tense, the glottalization of terminal plosive consonants, and the shift in stress in Detroit, for example, to Detroit. I tried to include as many typical examples as I could as we've been talking about, but again, do bear in mind I'm not pretending to be fluent in this dialect at all. Now, before we wrap up, I should probably say a little something about politics, because there are very few things more political in American society than race, especially when race is associated with blackness. And the language spoken by black people is no exception to this. As I said, along with other versions of English spoken by formerly enslaved peoples, African American Vernacular has long been seen by white linguistic authorities and by the white popular press or media as simply an inferior version of English, a broken version of English. What I hope you've gotten the sense of over this last little talk is that just as Jamaican Creole and Gullah, it does everything a language needs to do for the speech community that uses it, and therefore is deserving of none of the scorn that's often directed toward it. There have been, however, a few specific historic points, or incidents rather, where the language itself has become embroiled in social conflict, some of these quite widespread. In 1979, for example, the Board of Education in Ann Arbor, Michigan, released a statement to the effect that students should be allowed to learn how to read in their home dialects, in whatever version of English they happen to have been raised in, and from that position, then be taught to read in Standard English. This makes linguistic sense. One of the reasons why people from poor black communities, for example, have difficulty learning how to read Standard English is that they're actually having to learn to read in a dialect they don't speak or think in, whereas white middle-class students, for example, tend to be learning how to read in what is more or less their home dialect. The policy of the Ann Arbor Board of Education was directed at correcting that deficiency in the education system and allowing teachers to approach their students on the students' own terms and then guide them from there toward the language that they were actually supposed to be teaching them. This is sound pedagogy. Unfortunately, it caused quite a kerfuffle when, well, how do I put this? When oh-so-sensitive white people got wind of it. But I'm going to hold off on those details until I talk to you about the Oakland Unified School District decision of 1996. In Oakland, in the 1990s, it had become apparent to educators that the system was failing its black students. Now, this is a district in which, in many schools, the vast majority of students are black. And yet they were being taught in something like standard American English and corrected away from the dialects that they used at home. That is, they were being taught that their own dialect was bad English. This has definitely a demonstrable and negative effect on a child's development and self-image. But it's not just about self-image. As I said with the Ann Arbor case, or the Ann Arbor decision, there was a recognition here that children ought to be taught in their home dialect simply so that they can learn more effectively, and then from there be led to whatever it is that the teacher's job is to teach them, which in this case is standard English, which will practically serve them better if they or when they want to move up the social ladder. As I said, prestige dialects are prestige dialects for pragmatic reasons, and as long as one understands that and doesn't take them too seriously, I think it's a good idea to use them to one's advantage. But the educators in Oakland went one step further. They recognized Black American English as a language. They gave it official recognition. So after all of those decades and really centuries of black people being told that they were inferior according to a white standard, all of a sudden, their language had legal standing. And oh my goodness, did the latent racism of white American society ever come bubbling to the surface then? And honestly, I'm old enough to remember this. I remember editorials showing up in newspapers and on news programs, and various talking heads, usually but not always white, decrying the decline of proper English, proper American English, in favor of what then was often referred to as Ebonics, generally by non-linguists, just to be clear. Now, it's worth pointing out, I think, that for most of the time in which children have been going to school, for example, in the American South, they've been instructed in their home dialects, which in some cases aren't standard or general American English. But all of a sudden, when blackness was thrown into the mix, that really did change everything. There was, of course, a misunderstanding of the intent. Many people, either accidentally or deliberately, and probably some of both, misinterpreted the intent to be that this would be a mainstreaming of African American vernacular at the expense of standard American English. And while even if that were the case, the argument against instructing children in their home dialect is still very weak, that was actually not the case. As I said, the intent was simply for teachers to meet students where they were at. That is what good teachers do. And then guide them toward whatever the learning objectives happened to be. And the learning objectives hadn't changed, by the way. Just the means of getting there. And they changed so that more people could get there. But when the more people getting there happened to be black, all of a sudden, this became an issue. Now, that controversy, of course, is 25 years ago. It's largely died down, and one of the reasons why it's died down is that the folks in Oakland were right. There have been a number of studies since then indicating, unsurprisingly, that students taught in their home dialect learn more effectively and show better academic performance overall across all subjects, not merely in language. In any case, the reason I bring this up is simply as a reminder that even down to the present day, we are still dealing with the legacies of colonialism and the often latent and for a long time invisible assumptions of the superiority of essentially white ways of being as opposed to non-white ways of being. And these come up in various and often surprising ways, as for example we see with language instruction, or rather the language of instruction. Because of course, what adequate instruction does, what adequate teaching does, is level the playing field. Education is an equalizer. And socioeconomically, the American education system is actually set up to keep poor people poor and rich people rich. It's funded by county. So the richer the county, the better the schools are going to be. So the more advantages those children are going to have. That's not how we do things in Canada. And, well, it's one of many things that I think we do better here. Not everything, but many things. In any case, I think this has been an important chapter in the story of English for us to explore, even if just for a few minutes. And if some of you wanted to tackle this in your final essays, I would be very, very interested to see what you actually come up with. I've got some material I can recommend for you if you like. In the meantime, it's probably getting on time for me to be signing off. So, as always, thank you very much for listening, or perhaps for indulging me as I get the feeling I've rambled on a bit with this one as well. Please make sure that you listen to the YouTube clips that I've posted to the Moodle page. These are very useful in giving you a concrete sense of what I've been talking about rather abstractly. And for next time, we will be looking at Canadian English for the entire next lecture. Not just Canadian, but also, for a while at least, specifically at Maritime English, because it would be wrong to leave that out, and also because, God damn it, it's fun. But until then, I hope you're all well, and I do look forward to talking with you on Friday. Bye for now.